Today we're wrestling with a pretty terrifying and persistent idea
Uh-huh.
that the root cause of large-scale human conflict, of genocide, that it might be built right into our own cognitive software.
Right. Hardwired.
Exactly. I mean, every time we discuss stopping atrocities, the conversation, it always circles back to the same things. Tolerance campaigns, education,
Right.
and this beautiful but maybe impossible ideal of eliminating hatred.
And that conventional approach, that hopeful idea that we could just educate bias out of existence, is exactly what our sources are pushing back against.
Okay.
They're proposing a fundamental shift in perspective. What if?
Right.
What if the effort to eliminate bias is sort of like trying to eliminate breathing?
Wow.
What if the goal isn't to eradicate a moral failing, but to accept a structural reality?
Yeah.
And then design our systems around that reality.
That is a bold and I have to say a very counterintuitive proposition. The sheer ambition of trying to eradicate hatred is just exhausting.
It is.
Anyone who pays attention to global politics knows that. So what we're doing today is diving deep into material that says, essentially, stop trying to fix human nature.
And start fixing human institutions.
Yes. So our mission today is to explore this critical tension, the tension between our hardwired cognitive defaults, this constant, unavoidable creation of us and them, and the institutional responsibility we have.
A responsibility to design systems that prevent that cognitive friction from collapsing into mass murder.
Right.
And, this deep dive is really tailored for you, the listener, who might already have a bit of a healthy skepticism about all this.
I think that's fair if you look at history.
Exactly. If you look at human history and you see this continuous cycle of conflict, you're probably going to conclude we're never going to eliminate bias.
And you'd be right.
We agree. The complete fundamental prevention of genocide, eradicating the capacity for it, that's likely what our sources call an unachievable normative hope.
Okay, so that's the pessimism.
That's the pessimism. But accepting that structural pessimism, it frees us up to ask the really crucial, actionable question.
Which is?
If bias is inevitable, where precisely can we still stop the atrocity? We're basically trading in idealism for a concrete, pragmatic framework for intervention.
Okay, I like that. Trading idealism for pragmatism. Let's unpack this shift. All right, so this is where it gets really interesting and, frankly, a bit unsettling. The sources we've been analyzing, and they draw very heavily on social science, evolutionary biology.
Foundational stuff, yeah.
They push us to accept a very tough reality. They categorize this endless, noble effort to remove prejudice or eliminate hatred
Yeah.
as an unachievable normative hope.
And it's not that the goal isn't noble. Of course it is. It's that it's fundamentally misdirected.
Misdirected how?
If we keep treating large-scale bias as a cultural product,
Yeah.
Something we learn from the media or from our history books, we're missing the root of the problem.
So it's not learned.
The premise is that it's not primarily learned. The us and them dynamic isn't something just tacked on by culture. It is the human cognitive structure's default mode. It's the factory setting.
And why is that distinction between a learned flaw and an innate feature so incredibly critical?
Because if you fundamentally misdiagnose the problem, all of your solutions are going to fail. Think about it like software.
Okay.
If you think your system is slow because of a virus, a learned flaw, you run antivirus software.
Right, you try to remove it.
But if you realize the system is slow because the processor itself is architecturally limited, an innate feature, you have to change the entire physical hardware. Or you have to build constraints around how much data it can even process.
And we've been running the antivirus software for decades.
We have. We've spent decades trying to debug the system through education, but the evidence suggests we need to be building containment structures around a processor that is, for lack of a better term, hardwired for tribalism.
So what's the mechanism there? Why are we wired this way? Is it just leftover from our history, or is there a real evolutionary advantage to this instant classification?
Oh, absolutely. It comes down to cognitive efficiency and survival, which are deeply, deeply intertwined. Our brains are optimization machines.
They have to be.
They have to be. In a hostile, complex environment, which is where we spent most of our evolutionary history, it's incredibly costly both in time and energy to analyze every new individual and group neutrally. It's just not efficient.
So the brain defaults to shortcuts.
To rapid pattern recognition, exactly. Is it safe? Is it a competitor for resources? Does it belong to our group, which implies safety and shared risk?
Or their group, which implies potential threat.
And that rapid assessment is efficient and was, historically, often the difference between life and death.
So establishing us and them is simply the fastest, most resource-efficient way for the brain to navigate a complicated social world. It's a sorting mechanism.
Precisely. It reduces cognitive load dramatically. And we have just overwhelming experimental evidence that proves this dynamic is immediate, it's reactive, and it requires shockingly little stimulus to get going.
Okay, so let's get into that evidence, because that's what makes this more than just a theory.
Let's look at the 3 classic psychological experiments that really cemented this structural view.
The first one is famous, but it's still chilling every time I hear about it. The Robbers Cave experiment.
On the Robbers Cave study, yeah. Conducted back in the 1950s by Muzaffar Sharif, it's really foundational for showing how fast group identity can create hostility.
So what did they do?
They took a group of 11-year-old boys, and they were very carefully screened to be psychologically similar, stable. These were not problem children.
Right, they were all from similar, stable, middle-class backgrounds. They were controlling the variables.
Totally. And they sent them to a summer camp, split them into 2 groups, the Rattlers and the Eagles. For the first week, nothing. They just bonded within their own groups, no hostility at all.
And then they introduced competition, a simple tournament.
A simple tournament structure where one group could win prizes, jackknives, medals, and the other group would get nothing. They would lose.
And that was the spark.
That single condition competition was all the friction they needed. Immediately, the groups stopped being collections of individual boys. They became aggressive, stereotyping, hostile entities.
What kind of stuff were they doing?
I mean, they were burning each other's flags, raiding each other's cabins, calling each other derogatory names. They were actively sabotaging the other group's efforts. The hostility was profound and instantaneous.
And this is the key point, right? The boys had no prior reason to dislike each other. They were random assignments.
None whatsoever. The mere designation of the group, the cognitive classification of us versus them, was the accelerant for hostility, for negative stereotyping, for aggressive behavior.
It really supports the idea that the underlying structure for hostility is just. It's always there. It's just waiting for the minimal condition, in this case competition, to switch it on.
Exactly. But if Robbers Cave shows hostility emerges quickly under competition, the next experiment is maybe even more disturbing.
Why is that?
It shows that bias emerges even when there is no competition, even when the groups are completely and utterly meaningless.
And that brings us to the really shocking findings of the minimal group paradigm.
This is where the structural argument just crystallizes. The minimal group paradigm studies, they were designed by Henri Tachfel and his colleagues to strip away every single meaningful variable you can think of.
Like what?
History, culture, status, and crucially, competition. And they wanted to see if bias still appeared. The results were stark.
So how did they create the groups?
Participants were arbitrarily assigned to groups based on the most minimal classification imaginable.
We're talking about things like, did you estimate there were more dots or fewer dots on this screen than the average person?
That's one of them, yeah. Or another famous one was, do you prefer the abstract paintings of the artist Kandinsky or Klee?
That's it. That's the basis for the group.
That's it. A designation so meaningless, so arbitrary, that if you saw your group assignment on the street, you'd forget it 5 minutes later.
Okay, so they're in these meaningless groups. Then what happens?
They're asked to do a resource allocation task. Give out points, or small sums of money, to members of their own group and members of the other, arbitrary group. And that's where the bias and discrimination emerged systematically.
But wait, just to be clear, they weren't giving the points or money to themselves, right?
Correct.
Ah.
And this is the most profound and, frankly, irrational finding. Participants were given these matrices with choices.
Okay.
One choice might maximize the total payout for everyone involved, the absolute gain. Maybe it gives 10 points to an in-group member and 9 to an out-group member. Total of 19 points.
So that's the rational choice, the most good for the most people.
You'd think so. But another choice on the matrix might give slightly less money overall. Let's say 7 points to the in-group and only 2 to the out-group. A total of 9 points?
Way less overall.
Way less. But critically, it created a larger difference in favor of the in-group. It created relative gain.
So they were willing to accept less overall wealth, less total points being distributed.
Just to ensure that their arbitrary in-group did better relative to the arbitrary out-group.
That is the irrational core of tribal bias right there.
It's laid bare. The need to establish difference and partiality, The drive for relative group success, it's so profound that it overrides both rational self-interest and overall efficiency.
So humans will project difference and partiality onto the smallest, most meaningless classification possible.
It's overwhelming evidence that bias is an inherent cognitive strategy, not just some learned behavior we can unlearn through a workshop.
That's deeply unsettling. I mean, if we're hardwired to prefer our group, even when it costs us overall, how do we ever achieve large-scale rational cooperation?
That's the thing. It forces us to accept that large-scale cooperation isn't the default state, it's the achievement.
It's the exception, not the rule.
Exactly.
Yeah.
It requires elaborate, high-cost institutional structures to sustain it. The default is tribal preference.
And this inherent pattern-seeking nature, that's further illustrated by the research related to pattern recognition, often tied to those Kandinsky and Klee names. Can you tell us more about how the brain turns just noise into a potential threat?
Yeah, the Kandinsky and Klee experiments were actually precursors to the minimal group paradigm, but they help illustrate a deeper point about pattern projection. We are fundamentally wired to project pattern, intention, and agency onto noise. It's just what we do.
Why?
When we see abstract shapes or encounter unfamiliar social stimuli, we immediately try to categorize them and attribute motives. This is the evolutionary legacy of needing to spot the predator in the tall grass.
It's always better to see a predator that isn't there than to miss one that is.
Always. It's better to over-attribute threat than to under-attribute it.
And when you combine that immediate automatic pattern recognition with the need for security and the minimal group paradigm's desire for relative difference,
the projected pattern often defaults to a threat pattern directed at them.
of course.
The cognitive system operates on a principle of better safe than sorry. Stereotypes, which are really just fast generalizations about a group, are essentially the brain's high-efficiency mechanism for reducing the uncertainty associated with an outgroup.
So this constant projection, reinforced by this irrational in-group favoritism, it just makes the emergence of bias truly unavoidable.
It's a feature designed for survival in small competitive groups, not a bug of modern morality.
So if we accept this structural reality that us and them is unavoidable, it immediately clarifies a critical observation about atrocity that, you, the listener, have probably noticed. Genocides and mass killings are overwhelmingly directed toward internal neighbors, not external others.
This confirms the deeply internal nature of atrocity. If bias were fully about foreign invasion or external threats, the dividing line would be a geographical border.
But that's not what we see in history.
The history tells a very different story. The boundary, the dividing line, runs right through the heart of a society. The Hutus and Tutsis, the Serbs and the Bosniaks, the victims in the Holocaust, these groups lived side by side for generations.
And that familiarity, far from breeding tolerance, often creates the exact conditions for intense existential competition over resources, status, historical narrative.
And the target is easier to identify, closer to hand, and often already integrated into the state's systems, which makes them easier to track and to execute violence against.
Right.
So the inherent cognitive default means the group division is always ready to be activated. The easiest target is often the one who lives next door, the one whose status and success you feel threatens your own in-group standing.
Which is why trying to simply eliminate prejudice feels like, like trying to eliminate a core function of the human operating system. But wait a second, if this mechanism is truly hardwired and permanent, why don't all societies collapse into genocide? Doesn't that sort of contradict the idea of inevitability? If the bias is inevitable, shouldn't the outcome also be inevitable?
That is the perfect question. And it's the bridge to the entire second half of our deep dive. The bias is inevitable, but the atrocity is not. The internal pressure cooker we talked about, stages 1 and 2, that is always present. What prevents the explosion is the institutional structure we build around that pressure cooker.
So it's about containment.
It's the difference between a high-pressure system that has robust safety valves and one that has none.
Okay, that reframes the entire mission. The structural pessimism is warranted regarding human nature, but it has to be met with structural optimism regarding institutional design. But before we get to the solution, we have to look at how this internal bias is being weaponized on a global scale by systems that don't even intend to do harm. Big tech. Okay, so let's pivot to one of the most pressing contemporary challenges. How does this deep-seated, hardwired cognitive bias get catastrophically amplified in our modern digital infrastructure?
Hmm.
And we are using the devastating case of the Myanmar Rohingya crisis as the object lesson here. This isn't about blaming individuals, but about understanding the mechanics of how a seemingly neutral technological system can translate our inevitable bias into real-world catastrophe.
The Myanmar case is crucial because it wasn't a state actor directly ordering a platform to execute a plan. It was the platform's own internal logic that created the conditions for genocide.
And that starts with the goal of the platform.
We must first detail the corporate objective function because this defines everything. For big tech, particularly social media platforms, the singular measure of success is user engagement maximization.
Engagement is the lifeblood. More clicks, more shares, more comments, more time spent dwelling on the platform.
Right.
That's the metric that drives billions of dollars in advertising revenue.
And this is the central problem. The algorithm is constantly running millions of A/B tests globally to find out what keeps those eyeballs glued to the screen. And it quickly discovers a universal truth about the human psyche.
A truth rooted in the bias we just discussed.
Precisely. It learns that anger, fear, and moral hatred are significantly more potent drivers of engagement than content that promotes, say, civic understanding or calm discussion. Tribal conflict and moral outrage keep people coming back.
So the system learns what works best for its bottom line, and what works best is amplifying the negative stuff. It's amplifying what we're calling stage 2 and pushing towards stage 3.
Exactly. In Myanmar, the system found that highly viral, emotionally resonant, dehumanizing content that targeted the Rohingya ethnic minority, framing them as intruders, threats, vermin. It performed optimally under the engagement maximization metric.
And so that content was prioritized.
It was prioritized, amplified, and distributed to millions of users, far outpacing any balanced or factual information.
Which leads us to the algorithmic failure itself. The sources repeatedly point out this profound and dangerous limitation. The algorithm has absolutely no capacity for moral judgment.
Zero.
It cannot distinguish between a viral cat video and viral propaganda urging ethnic cleansing.
It's completely blind to the systemic cost. The algorithm's only concern is its internal metric, dwelling time. It cannot pause and ask itself, does the amplification of this particular piece of content, which is making our shareholders richer, does it have the external consequence of accelerating mass murder?
It only calculates whether this content gets more clicks than the content next to it.
That's it. And in Myanmar, the system became the unwitting yet highly efficient amplifier of dehumanization.
So this brings us to that crucial insight. AI did not initiate the genocide, but the human-designed metric, engagement, failed to recognize the possibility of genocide as a system cost.
It's a risk management failure of astronomical proportions. They just didn't calculate the external cost into the internal optimization function.
They wanted engagement.
They wanted engagement. And because the human cognitive default responds powerfully to tribal outrage, the system delivered engagement. But the cost was societal collapse and atrocity.
If the platform had an objective function that included a penalty for, say, systemic political violence, or a negative weighting for content that activates stage 3 moral justification rhetoric, the outcome could have been different.
It might have been. But those ethical parameters are complex, they're hard to define, and they're really hard to monetize.
And there's another layer to this, right? The problem is compounded dramatically in non-Western, low-resource languages like Burmese.
Oh, massively. The platforms invest heavily in content moderation and sophisticated detection algorithms for high-resource languages like English, French, German.
Like the big markets?
The big markets. But the content moderation capability in languages associated with emerging or developing markets is often, well, it's far, far weaker.
Which means the viral, dehumanizing rhetoric, the very content most likely to drive a stage 3 narrative, can spread virtually unchecked.
It proliferates because the platform simply hasn't devoted the necessary resources to policing that language, that imagery, or those specific cultural references.
It's a dangerous loophole.
It's a massive one. You've got this combination of an optimization function that rewards outrage and an infrastructure that is under-resourced in the very places where political friction is highest. It created the perfect digital weapon for the perpetrators.
The system took the inherent, unavoidable human bias and scaled it to institutional velocity.
Yes.
This leads us directly to the reality check on regulation. The normative statement is undeniable. AI should be designed as a preventative infrastructure. It should be programmed to suppress conflict, to act as a digital gatekeeper against stage 3 rhetoric.
But you, the listener, are right to be skeptical that this ideal is going to be realized under the current conditions.
Why not?
The existing incentive structure is a massive, impenetrable roadblock. We're governed by shareholder value, by fiduciary duty to maximize profits, and by these engagement-based revenue models.
So asking these companies to fundamentally change their algorithmic function to prioritize social stability over shareholder value, you're asking them to accept a multi-billion-dollar hit to their profitability.
And it would require a level of regulatory intervention that challenges the core profitability model of the world's largest companies. There are proposals out there,
Like what?
like mandating independent, real-time risk assessments for platform amplification policies, or holding executives legally liable for predictable, foreseeable system failures that lead to mass violence.
But those face intense lobbying.
Intense lobbying and huge legal challenges rooted in governance norms and, of course, free speech protections.
So we face this vast, terrifying gap. We know what is technologically possible. We could design a morally conscious AI that downweights dehumanizing content, but we are stuck with what is politically and economically implemented.
Which is systems optimized for outrage and profit, regardless of the external cost.
The takeaway from this section is pretty sobering.
It is. If we can't eliminate the bias, and the global infrastructure is optimized to weaponize it for profit, then we have to abandon the ideal of removal and focus on the pragmatism of control. We need to shift the frame entirely.
And this is the pivot point of our entire discussion. If structural pessimism regarding human nature is warranted, then we have to dismiss the wrong question.
Which is, can we eliminate genocide?
Right. That question is aimed at an unachievable moral cure.
So we have to embrace the accurate question, which is, if the cognitive groundwork for genocide is always present, where can we limit it, and where can we stop its progression from thought to state action?
It's a fundamental shift from seeking idealism to enforcing risk management.
Exactly.
I find the medical comparison that's used in our sources to be incredibly helpful here.
Yeah, the cancer analogy.
If you're treating an aggressive, currently incurable illness, say a particularly virulent form of cancer eradication is just off the table. That is not the goal. But the effort is far from meaningless.
Right. In that medical context, success is defined differently. It's defined by early diagnosis, progression suppression, remission, survival extension.
Those are meaningful, moral, and achievable goals.
And we have to apply that exact cold logic to atrocity prevention. Our goal shifts from eliminating the disease of bias to building an immune system robust enough to suppress its lethal effects, which is institutionalized murder.
So, if stage 1 and 2 bias is unavoidable, the target of control has to shift entirely to the transition stage.
The stage that converts that inevitable bias and emotion into formal, coordinated state action.
We have to map the path to atrocity with clinical precision to define the exact point of intervention.
Let's do that. Let's outline the 5 sequential stages of human group cognition and institutional action, moving from the genetic default toward the physical act. Understanding these stages is the key to identifying the choke point.
Okay, let's go through them. Stage 1, classification, use them.
As we established in Section 1, this is the cognitive default. It is unavoidable. It happens the moment 2 groups are defined, arbitrarily or not. It's just the brain sorting data efficiently.
Stage 2, negative effect attribution.
This is when the classification gets emotional baggage, often fueled by economic friction or historical trauma. The them group is assigned negative characteristics. Untrustworthy, disloyal, lazy, a threat to the social order.
And this is common?
This is common in all complex societies, and it's extremely difficult to fully suppress, especially because of the optimization mechanisms we just saw in big tech.
Okay. Stage 3, moral justification.
Now, this is the critical juncture. This is the point where we need maximum focus. The negative affect graduates into a structured ideology.
What does that look like?
The them group is framed not just as a problem, but as a cancer, a pestilence, or a fundamental threat requiring purification or removal. This framing makes hostile state action seem rational, necessary, or even inevitable.
If you think about the language of historical genocides, it moves beyond just dislike.
Way beyond. It involves dehumanizing metaphors, calling people rats or cockroaches. This process is the intellectual green light for physical action. It takes the emotional disgust of stage 2 and converts it into a structured, rational-sounding narrative for policy. This is the crucial point of intervention.
So after that justification comes stage 4, institutionalization.
This is the switch from rhetoric to structure, from hate speech to official policy.
So this is where the state gets involved.
This involves the formal approval and use of the primary instruments of state power, the law, the military, and state media, to execute action against the justified group. Anger becomes a legal mandate. Dehumanization becomes an official, coordinated government program.
And you see the stage marked by things like specific legal exclusions, military orders, resource allocation for the execution.
And state-run propaganda designed to coordinate the physical violence.
Yes. And then finally, stage 5, physical removal.
The atrocity itself. The mass killings, the forced displacement, systematic starvation, mass rape, all carried out by the mechanisms that were established and coordinated in stage 4.
Okay, so if we map it out like that, if stages 1 and 2 are effectively permanent cognitive facts we can't remove, and stage 5 is the horrible consequence we are trying to avoid,
Then prevention is only effective, and our resources are only efficiently spent at the switch.
the switch between stage 3, justification, and stage 4, institutionalization.
That is the intervention window. That's the moment when abstract hate solidifies into policy.
So we can spend boundless resources running campaigns to make people stop classifying themselves into groups, stage 1.
And those resources will achieve minimal structural change.
But we must dedicate maximum resources to ensuring that stage 3 justifications, no matter how prevalent or compelling they are in the rhetoric, never gain the formal systemic power of stage 4 state institutions.
That's the firewall.
The ultimate goal, then, isn't to change the individual hater's mind. It's to build such high, robust institutional walls that even when the most compelling moral justification narrative is screaming for state action, that action cannot be legally, militarily, or logistically executed.
Which shifts the entire focus of atrocity prevention. It moves it away from morality and psychology and puts it squarely in the realm of political science and law.
So the intervention is not a matter of changing hearts.
It is a pragmatic, cold, hard focus on controlling the levers of state power, the integrity of the judicial system, and the command structure of the military.
Okay, so this framework leads us to the final, pragmatic, and maybe the most honest conclusion of this entire deep dive.
Yeah.
If we're truly dedicated to prevention, we have to accept that genocide cannot be eliminated, but it can be prevented from ever being approved as a normal policy choice or a justified outcome by the state.
And this isn't just semantics. It is a massive shift in resource allocation and focus.
What does that mean in practice?
It means we acknowledge that hatred will always exist in some segment of the population, maybe a highly vocal, highly motivated segment. But we have to ensure the system itself is structurally incapable of adopting that hatred as its official operating mandate.
It stops being a question of the evolution of human nature.
And becomes entirely a question of institutional threshold or gatekeeping. The resilience of the state structure itself is the ultimate defense.
So we need to assess how strong the constitutional constraints are. The legal checks and balances, the military's ethical code regarding civilian population protection, the media's editorial independence, all of it.
And these structures have to be hardened specifically to absorb the shock of a stage 3 moral justification without collapsing into a stage 4 institutionalization.
If the structure's brittle, the transition is seamless.
But if the structure is resilient, the transition is impossible, or at least highly, highly costly.
Let's provide some concrete examples that illustrate this institutional difference, because this is where the framework becomes really actionable for how we might govern societies going forward.
Okay, let's contrast the scenarios. A society containing prevalent, deeply repulsive hate speech, filled with rhetoric that moves through classification, negative affect, and reaches the level of moral justification. Stage 3.
Right.
That society is fundamentally not the same as a society that institutionalizes mass killing through law or military order. Stage 4.
Okay, so let's take the first scenario, the social problem. You have an extremist group that holds the deep conviction that another ethnic group is vermin and must be purged. That's stage 3. It's hateful. It's a social poison.
It drives local violence and tension, for sure. But in a society with a robust institutional threshold, a great example is post-WWII, Germany's foundational constitutional design, that hateful conviction remains politically marginal.
And legally impotent.
The military is mandated to protect all citizens, regardless of the rhetoric. The legal system cannot pass laws that disenfranchise or mandate the targeting of that group for removal.
The state media can't formally execute the propaganda required to coordinate the action.
Because the media is pluralistic and independent. The threshold holds. The violence remains localized or rhetorical, but it does not become state action.
The genius of the post-WWII German constitutional structure, for example, was that it recognized the psychological vulnerability to these stage 3 justifications,
Yes.
and it deliberately put constitutional walls around the military and the judiciary to make sure no political movement could easily corrupt them and transform rhetoric into policy. That was the institutional lesson learned from the Holocaust.
That is institutional threshold design in action. Now, contrast that with pre-genocide Rwanda in 1994. The institutions were incredibly brittle,
The media was largely state control.
or allied with the Hutu power ideology. Radio Mill Collins was the perfect stage 3 justification machine. It turned the narrative of the Tutsi threat into a policy necessity.
And the military and police forces were either already politicized or easily corrupted by that stage 3 rhetoric.
So when the order came, the institutions of the state, the military command, the police, the local administrative authorities, they were immediately ready for stage 4 implementation. The threshold failed to hold.
The transition was seamless.
The institutional difference is the key metric. The difference between stage 3 and stage 4 is the difference between an individual holding a hateful ideology and the state using its coercive power, its laws, its weapons, its communication systems to execute that ideology.
And we have to apply this difference threshold back to big tech as well.
Right.
A social platform that spreads rage, amplifying stages 2 and 3, well, that's catastrophic.
It is not the same as a society where the military and legal apparatus are mandated to execute that rage.
Right.
While big tech enables the acceleration of bias, the military and the law are the instruments of mass murder. Our ultimate institutional focus has to be on preventing those instruments from being turned against the citizenry.
So the ultimate goal is to make the decision to conduct genocide politically and legally irrational.
It must be seen by any ruling regime not as a feasible policy option, not as a way to solve a political or demographic problem, but as a guaranteed road to internal collapse, international isolation, and personal accountability. It's about raising the systemic cost of stage 4 implementation to an impossible level.
This whole thesis, which accepts the permanence of human flaws but focuses so ruthlessly on governance design, is best described as tragedy management. It's pragmatic, almost cold in its realism.
It accepts the permanence of the tragic element, the human bias, the capacity for hatred, the unavoidable justum, and focuses resources on building robust, high institutional walls to contain the consequences. We manage the tragedy by ensuring the state does not become its primary instrument.
So it shifts the ethical burden from the impossible task of changing 7 billion individual brains
To the difficult but possible task of perfecting the accountability and structure of a few hundred major institutions.
And that, our sources argue, is an achievable goal.
Because structures can be designed, laws can be written, and thresholds can be fortified. We are not fighting biology. We are fighting brittle governance.
This has been a profound, and I have to say, a challenging deep dive. It forces us to set aside some of our most cherished liberal ideals about simply eliminating prejudice through education.
It does.
And the final synthesis is clear. The honest approach to atrocity prevention requires accepting the permanent existence of us-them bias. The idealism of eliminating hate is structurally unsound because it misdiagnoses the problem.
Therefore, the focus has to shift entirely from idealism to institutional threshold design. Right. We have to spend our resources not on the unachievable goal of eliminating stage 1 or 2, but on creating unbreakable barriers between stage 3, moral justification, and stage 4, institutionalization.
The architecture of state power is the solution, not the human heart.
Right.
So what stands out to you in all of this? If the system's ability to conduct mass murder is directly related to the brittleness of its institutional structure, what does that say about the state of governance and technology today? We saw how big tech accelerates stage 3 rhetoric globally, even when the platform is not the state itself. Does that mean we need to start framing platform governance, algorithmic transparency, content moderation resources as a critical component of institutional resilience?
Absolutely. The practical mission moving forward can be framed under the powerful thesis we pulled from our sources: unpreventable bias, preventable atrocity.
Unpreventable bias, preventable atrocity.
And we invite you, the listener, to consider what this means for current social media governance, for the role of military and police accountability globally, and for the resilience of democratic legal structures. If the bias is unpreventable, every single institutional check is the only thing standing between political anger and mass graves.
So the final thought is this.
Think about which institutions are currently failing their gatekeeping roles and what their collapse might enable in a world that is saturated with digitized, profitable outrage?
That is a critical question to end on. Thank you for joining us on the deep dive.